Good evening, everyone. So we're in chapter 9, and we've got 4 or 5 small passages. There are a few passages in chapter 10, which we'll probably get to, and then if we get through all of that, we'll get on to chapter 11. Chapter 10 is the thinnest of the chapters, written by Hank Parkhurst or Hark Pankhurst, one of the two. Hank Parkhurst, that sounds right. And uh, it's perfectly good, but it's not really to our purpose, except for a few isolated passages. Now, uh, the book is wonderfully bluff in its philosophy. It says, avoid then the deliberate manufacture of misery, but if trouble comes, cheerfully capitalize it as an opportunity to demonstrate his omnipotence. Now, if any of you have been on social media in the last decade or two, you've probably come across quite a few people who are convinced that their misery is manufactured by other people, and that if they explain carefully how other people are manufacturing their misery, then they'll stop doing it. I don't see any sign of this working. I think this has probably been going on for a very, very long time, 5 or 6 thousand years ago. When you look at the Abyssinian tablets, they're a little slower to produce, but people were just as diligent about complaining that their misery was caused by other people. So this is almost a flippant line in the book, but it's incredibly radical. It says, if I'm miserable, it's my fault. Now, how am I producing my misery? I can't control every event that happens. I certainly am responsible, increasingly, as an adult, for the condition of my life. As I said the other day, there's that wonderful TikTok where a girl is complaining that her best friend, who's been to rather a lot of psychotherapy, is becoming intolerable. And she says, "You're 31. I'm pretty sure things become your fault soon." So I can't control the things that happen, although I do have some responsibility there. And those things are going to cause some pain. But there's nothing wrong with pain. Pain, if allowed to pass, is perfectly ordinary. It's simply one of the instruments of the orchestra. And I'm told there are certain places in London where you can pay people to inflict pain on you. So there are certainly people that enjoy pain in all sorts of ways. Same as fear. People complain about fear, then they go and watch The Exorcist. Apparently fear isn't always the thing it's cracked up to be or cracked down to be. There's nothing wrong with the emotion. The problem is when a rotten thing happens, I then build a superstructure narrative on top of it, which produces a second layer of feelings. Now, that superstructure narrative is very, very different than the event that happens. The event that happens is like driving along and seeing a disagreeable thing by the side of the road, or bumping over some sort of small creature that has crossed the road. But as you proceed, because time is passing, you're getting further and further away from it. And if you are open to reality, what you're doing is experiencing other things which then displace the pain. So the pain is one tiny thing in this endless stream of emotions, many of which are good, some of which are neutral, and some of which are bad. Now, the superstructure narrative which I build on top of that, it's like letting off some noxious gas within the car, which you then carry with you wherever you go. It becomes like a permanent state of emergency, a permanent suffocation. You hear people sometimes talking about their childhood in very plaintive terms, as though the mother is still standing over them with the frying pan or the barbed comment about their hair or something, as though it's only just happened 5 minutes ago, as opposed to 30 years ago. That, I would say, is the manufacture of misery. It's building a mental universe to sit within in which I suffer and it's other people's fault and there is nothing I can do about it. And that is the thing that I think, as a byproduct of doing the steps, is the really life transforming aspect. people often talk about love, and if you want to, if you want to score points, as it were, in an AA meeting, all you have to do is say, love is all, love is everything. All we need to do is love each other, lovely, loving creatures, loving other lovely creatures, because God loves us all, and you love us, and we love you, and everything is love. And it's all very well, but it doesn't achieve anything. It may be perfectly true. What achieves something is work. And what's the work? I'm wrong again. I'm wrong again. Over and over and over, overturning my perception of what is going on and replacing it with the truth, and being willing to suffer the repeated humiliation of being wrong for years in a row, admitting faults to others, going and making amends, sitting explaining the book a bazillionth time. That's the work, and that's the thing which brings about change. I think love is part of it, but it's not the engine of the whole thing. It might be the lubrication in the engine which enables it to function smoothly, but it is not the mechanics, and there's a fundamental difference between the two. The second part of the line, if trouble comes, cheerfully capitalise it as an opportunity to demonstrate his omnipotence. As I may have mentioned in double entry bookkeeping, a debit, if it is simply allowed to be an expense, is a bad thing on your profit and loss account. If you use it to generate business, if you use the expense to generate business, like research and development, it becomes an asset on your balance sheet. So what I do, I adopt this very literally. If something happens that I don't like, and there's a terrible risk that I might pour me another drink over it, I say, right, this is trouble. Therefore, what I'm going to do, God, I'm going to give this to you before the trouble soaks through the outer clothing onto my skin. I'm going to give it to you and say, I'm going to really look forward to how you, God, are going to solve this, because I don't have a clue. It's going to be a fascinating journey. And to say that right at the beginning of the trouble, the absolute worst thing to do is to open the door to trouble, let it in, let it bring all of its friends and relatives, like Rabbit and Winnie the Pooh, and they take up, they start to occupy the entire building, and then 6 weeks later you go to your sponsor and say, my house is full of rabbits, what do I do about it? Well, you shouldn't have let them in the first place. Much easier not to let it in than to get rid of them afterwards. I have nothing against rabbits. They're ravaging a certain part of France at the moment, but that's not our problem. Now, next section. Be patient about getting well. Tom W.'s sponsor apparently would say, don't expect much to change. Now, that's a little bit pessimistic. My last sponsor, but one or two, I lose count. I have a list somewhere. It's like in churches where there's a sort of list of the former church wardens. One of them said, for the first 10 years, he said the first 10 years are early recovery. And I got to 10 years, I said, 10 years! He said the first 20 years are early recovery. I said, what? As though I'd been mishearing it all along. I think he moved the goalposts at that time, at that point. Now, a lot of things, I don't want to be depressing, but the reason not to be depressed about this is because there are lots of low-hanging fruit. There's an awful lot that can be improved in the first year. I think 80% of the improvement in affect happens in the first year, and then everything else is a slow improvement after that. In the first year, it's still going to be very volatile. Stability comes a lot later. In other words, to have patience with oneself about things taking a long time. But what is terribly interesting, we're convinced that a spiritual mode of living is a most powerful health restorative. Now, don't do this because people will get very cross with you if you do this. If you go to an Al-Anon meeting and hand out a questionnaire saying, what medical conditions do you have? You'll discover that almost everyone has joint problems, inflammatory conditions, skin conditions, constant infections, various forms of ME or chronic fatigue, or that whole sort of cluster of general physical hopelessness. Endocrinological problems, I get a point for saying that, difficult word. People are full of these physical problems, and what is remarkable, I've known people in Al-Anon, and I shit you not, who came to Al-Anon in a wheelchair, and 10 years later are fine, because they did the work. Now, it sounds like an improbable thing to say. I'm not to promise anyone in a wheelchair that if they go to Al-Anon, then there'll be this sort of... Sometimes you see a wheelchair just left outside a supermarket, Lidl, say, and you think, do they have some miraculous butter in there which has cured this person? But anyway, I'm getting off the point. The point is, it is remarkable, it is miraculous, the changes that take place, and don't underestimate the ability of the mind to affect the body. Now, the next line is one of those ones which is quite right, quite true, but gets misused. Now, the misuse of AA principles within AA is a good old habit which has gone on for a very long time. It's where you take something out of context and you construe something to mean, don't believe what the big book says, don't make any effort, don't do anything. So things like, we know but a little. I've heard people say, aha, you see, they recognise that the big book is not all it's cracked up to be. We've told you a little about alcoholism. You see, we've learnt so much since then. Any way to devalue the book. I've heard that I know someone in AA, is a perfectly nice chap, but part of his MO is to go around big book meetings and say, well, Bill W. was depressed when he was 20 years sober. So much for this spiritual awakening that he was promised, to try to degrade the people's perception of the big book. And one of the interesting ways this line gets used, I'll read the line. This does not mean that we disregard human health measures. God has abundantly supplied this world with fine doctors, psychologists, and practitioners of various kinds. Do not hesitate to take your health problems to such persons. Absolutely right. But you will hear this line used to say, and I've literally heard people say this frequently over the years, the best thing AA has done is keep me sober so that I can go and do the outside things, and it's the outside things that have brought about all the changes. And to be fair, in those people, that may well be the case. But when I look at my own experience, I certainly needed doctors for physiological problems and psychologists for psychological problems. Now, my emotions are a function not just of my physiology, not just my psychology, the way my mind operates, my cognitive processes, my framing and reframing of situations. It's also a function of my practical circumstances, my social interactions with others, my general philosophy of life, my morality, my moral standards and whether I'm living up to them, my spirituality, my relationship with God, and finally, the bonus 8th area, if you have one, if religion is a factor, then if that's taken care of, that is going to feed into my overall experience of life. Now, my problem was that I was having frightful problems at the level of emotion and experience. And I thought that a psychologist could solve that. And a psychologist can't, because their area is the psyche, the mind. And my problems were in all 8 areas. I needed all 8 areas to be sorted out in order for my experience of life to change. So there's nothing wrong with those outside people, but they're there for certain things. They're not there. For instance, a psychologist is not there to instruct me on what my philosophy of life should be, and the doctor isn't there to teach me how to manage my money and pay my bills on time, so I'm not constantly anxious about my bank card being sucked into the machine and disappearing forever. These are different domains. The next one is right at the end of the chapter, and I absolutely love it. And I'll read it out. There was no doubt he overindulged. This is about the smoking husband. Seeing this, and I love this, meaning to be helpful, his wife commenced to admonish him about it. Meaning to be helpful, my foot. Anyway, she admonishes him. He admitted he was overdoing these things, but frankly said that he was not ready to stop. His wife is one of those persons who really feels there is something rather sinful about these commodities, so she nagged, and her intolerance finally threw him into a fit of anger. He got drunk. And it goes on to say, she sees she was wrong to make a burning issue out of such a matter when his more serious ailments were being rapidly cured. This is an instruction to me to do two things. First of all, mind my own business and admonish only where it's really my job to, and there are things where it is my job to. But then, obviously, tone is important. Now, in sponsorship, the longer you are in the fellowship, whichever fellowship it is, it's all the same really when it comes to this question. A sponsee presents in front of you and you find yourself almost overwhelmed with how many things you're observing, not because they're particularly unwell, but just because you have a lot of experience. And I got this incredibly wrong, and I now tend to try to deal with just one thing at a time. You might notice 47 things. Just deal with one thing. This is this last line. Don't pick on the small things when the larger ailments, the larger difficulties are commanding more attention. If you try to go in too hard on too many things, you'll lose the patient. They'll quite rightly go to someone else. The last three items are the three mottos. First things first, live and let live, easy does it. Now on easy does it, perfect example of one of those lines which gets misused. It gets misunderstood to mean don't do your step work, it's fine. Whereas actually what it means is don't go in hard and heavy with other people. Leave them alone. Give them some space. Think a little bit before you go in hard. Just a bit more gentle with people. That was the intention. If you read the other material about where that little slogan came from, that changes everything. Live and let live. This idea that my life is my business, your life is your business. It is only where the two intersect that we have common business, or it is only where someone is extending too far into my domain that it becomes my business. And first things first, I tell you, I think most of my emotional state, if I have a good emotional state on a given day, frankly, most of it is sleep, exercise and diet. You get those things sorted out and you're a very, very long way ahead of the crowd. First things first, also, a friend of mine, a great friend of mine, used to say that your average addict is unable to prioritise between major problems and minor problems. And his example was this: the house is on fire. Kitty needs feeding. What shall I do first? I think I'll feed Kitty first. Meanwhile, both you and Kitty burn up in the house fire. And I think that's very common. People, if you leave it to the sponsee to bring the most important problem to you, it won't even be in the top 10 of the things that are going on. So, rather miraculously, we're on to Chapter 10, which is the chapter to employers. There are a few little points which I'm going to bring up here. The first one, the simplicity of the programme. Here is the line. Without much ado, he accepted the principles and procedure that had helped us. And the thing that I would point out here, AA is not a fellowship, although it is a fellowship. It is a set of principles, and I think it's fascinating that it says procedure, not procedures. The whole thing is a single, indivisible set of actions. It all goes together. The fellowship is there to support the process, but the process is this, the principles and the procedure. The next line I've surtitled with "Don't be a mug." This is not to say that all alcoholics are honest and upright when not drinking. Of course that isn't so, and such people may often impose on you. Seeing your attempt to understand and help, some men will try to take advantage of your kindness. There are some characters, and by characters I don't mean good after-dinner speakers, I mean people you don't give the keys to. There are some characters who go to a fellowship in a city, let's keep this nice and anonymous, who go around causing the most frightful trouble, sharing 3 times longer than they're supposed to, and sharing aggressively at people in the room or about people in the room, and then using tradition 3 in order to claim the right to continue to attend and continue to interfere with the smooth operation of meetings. And it's not on. And all through the book, it's very clear. There's another one in chapter 11, which we might get to, where it says the same thing. Don't let people who are ill-intentioned take advantage of you. Don't let people who are ill-intentioned take advantage of a group. You're well within your rights to sort that out. The next section, now there's a theme which runs all the way through chapter 10 in particular, which is this idea, and it's in 3 different passages which I've collated, that either you've got someone who is willing and able, or you haven't. If they are willing and able, and I think in a sense they're both the same thing. If you've got someone who is willing and able, full steam ahead. If you haven't, drop it quickly. And one of the very difficult things when sponsoring people, no one is perfect by any stretch of the imagination. I certainly have gone through long periods of being very slipshod and lackluster with the programme, but not so much in the early days. In the first year I was pretty good. Now it can take a while because everyone is on a spectrum from sort of 7% effort to 100% effort. Now where is the line? Where do you decide that it's not working because the person doesn't have enough willingness and ability to do sufficient work to get the spacecraft off the ground? There's a certain, I don't know the physics of it, I don't have the physics terminology, but you've got to have a certain amount of power behind, let's say, the space shuttle with its rockets to get it up into the air and up into orbit. Without sufficient energy, it will just come straight back down. Now, if someone is putting, I don't know, 40%, 50%, 30% energy into it, they're not going to get off the ground. It's just never going to happen. You've got to be above a certain level, because the effort eventually defeats the process. The effort is painful and difficult. Unless you're getting the benefit, then it will simply stop being worth it. You just can't muscle through forever. You've got to muscle through at the beginning such a lot that you start getting benefits flooding in, and those benefits flooding in give you the impetus, give you the encouragement, the force, the strength, the oomph to actually keep going with the effort. So there needs to be, I don't know if it's terminal velocity or critical mass or whatever it is, the terms in physics. You've got to have enough willingness and energy to get the whole thing motoring. And once it's motoring, it's fine. It's like a self-propagating process. But you're not doing any favours to a sponsee, keeping them on when it's like pulling teeth or dragging someone through treacle. It's got to come from within. Because what you're doing, you're spoiling the process for them. You're turning the process into a hateful thing. I remember this poor girl at a meeting many years ago who was crying her eyes out. And I said, afterwards I spoke to her, why are you crying? And she was doing the step 4 from that wretched Big Book Awakening thing, where if it's not administered with due care, results, as it did in this case, with this poor girl with literally 4-lever arch files of papers full of inventories, repeating the same thing over and over again. I wouldn't be crying. I'd be in prison because I'd have killed the person who'd have told me to do that. But it poisons people against AA to turn it into something worse than it is. Bad enough as it is. You've told to turn it into something worse than it is. So it's best to let people just return to their natural condition and then decide that they actively want to do it, not to make up for people's lack of willingness with endless chivying encouragement. And apropos of that is the next set of 4 quotations. He should understand that he must undergo a change of heart. To get over drinking will require a transformation of thought and attitude. We all had to place recovery above everything, for without recovery, we would have lost both home and business. And there are a couple of things here. The putting recovery first means scheduling everything into the schedule before everything else. If the step work isn't scheduled first thing in the morning, it's not going to get done. If you haven't done it by the time you go to work, that's the end of it. With the change of heart, a transformation of thought and attitude. You can't transform your thought and attitude as an act of the will, as it says earlier, in a twinkling, but you can sincerely want to. You can sincerely make the decision that you want to make the AA philosophy and program your way of life and immediately want to start helping other people. It's not uncommon to see people who are 3 weeks sober, 6 weeks sober, come alive, catch light with the bug of wanting to help other people. It's the most heartening thing. And I think there is a decision there. There's certainly a natural inclination, but there's also a decision to do AA for its own sake, to do CA, to do Al-Anon for their own sake, and not to do them merely as a bolt onto one's life in order to get one's own way more effectively, which doesn't work. The role of physical recovery. The line here, the object of physical treatment is to thoroughly clear mind and body of the effects of alcohol. Your man will fare better if placed in such physical condition that he can think straight and no longer craves liquor. And again, I will sponsor people who are on medication in early days, but it's an uphill struggle, and the aim, ideally, it isn't always possible. The aim, ideally, is to get people in a condition where the emotions, the thoughts, are not being sidetracked by physiological processes. Next section. The recovering alcoholic is an adult who is responsible for themselves. That's my headline. And the line here is very interesting about if someone is given the chance to go into treatment and it's paid for by the employer. It says it should be made plain that any expense will later be deducted from his pay. It is better for him to feel fully responsible. When I was new I hate to be one of those people. When I was new 1,000 years ago, when things were better, I don't mean to go down that line. But when I was new, we didn't give books to people. They had to pay for them. And if they couldn't, they were loaned the money. Because the idea, if you're not paying for it, you won't value it. I have friends who have practiced as psychoanalysts or psychotherapists and say that the patients that don't pay for it, don't value it, don't take it seriously. And you meet people sometimes who've been in treatment 12 times or 15 times, and you wonder, this is a speculation and an unfair one, but would they have been in treatment 15 times if they'd had to pay for it? I took recovery very seriously when I was very new because there was no one to support me. I had to take responsibility, and that no cavalry was on its way. There was no one coming over the hills to save me, so I needed to sort myself out. And one shouldn't infantilize people, and there's a lot of running around fellowship sometimes trying to protect the so-called vulnerable newcomer. Some newcomers are genuinely vulnerable, but it's rare. Next one. This comes up all through the book. If the book is read the moment the patient is able, while acutely depressed, realization of his condition may come to him. In other words, when someone is thoroughly depressed, they're most likely to listen to the solution. If they, as Americans would say, still got this, if they got this, to any extent at all, they won't be listening. This is why, if you got a sponsee who's lukewarm, say, come back later. Let's just stop this. Come back when you're completely enthusiastic. Because half measures avail us nothing. One thing that's interesting is the next little passage. This is, as I said, written by Hank. The greatest enemies of us alcoholics are resentment. So he puts resentment first, but then he goes to jealousy, envy, frustration, and then fear. On page, I think, 263 of the big book, there's the story of a chap who had Dr. Bob as his sponsor, and Dr. Bob takes him through the program and runs through a list of major character defects. It's a very different list of character defects than Bill's. So Bill's main ones are resentment, fear, and sex. I think if you asked Lois what Bill's main ones were, it would have been sex, and grandiosity. But that's a different question, perhaps. Perhaps I'm being unfair there. But we all have different things. I think the unexamined defect is jealousy. There's almost nothing about it in the big book, but it is the destroyer of an awful lot of relationships and the motor behind the so-called toxic relationship is usually a mess of possession, jealousy, demands, and pass the parcel of blame. If your sponsee, with sponsees, you've got to find out what their major problems are because they may not be yours. Find out what's eating their lunch. And the next one, my headline is when push comes to shove, recovery comes first. And what Hank says, he may wish to do a lot for other alcoholics and something of the sort may come up during business hours. A reasonable amount of latitude will be helpful. This work is necessary to maintain his sobriety. I cut corners with a lot of things in my first year in order to do recovery, in order to do meetings, and I don't regret it a damn bit because I wouldn't have made it otherwise. I remember whenever I could, I went to an evening meeting. Whenever I could, I went to a bit of a lunchtime meeting. Even if I could only get there for 15 minutes, I would walk very quickly. I was working in the city, in the second year actually, I was working in the city, and I would walk sprint 20 minutes to the lunchtime meeting, have 20 minutes of the lunchtime meeting, and then walk or sprint 20 minutes back, get back to the office sort of sweating like a pig. But I got 20 minutes of the lunchtime meetings. There was me on the front row with my little hand up as usual, like Hermione, with Catriona, my friend, next to me, who was usually weeping. I've tried to find out where she is to see if she's still weeping. No one knows. Maybe she's okay, maybe she's not. But she was doing the same as me. She couldn't cope. So we didn't try to cope. We ran to meetings like idiot children. I remember times when I couldn't cope, so I would just go and sit outside the meeting 2.5 hours before it started, because at least no harm would come to me there. I don't see many people doing that, but that's what I did, and that was very effective. Technical footnote, there's a rather lurid passage in the chapter where our friend Hank says, "I well remember the shock I received when a prominent doctor in Chicago told me of cases where pressure of the spinal fluid actually ruptured the brain. No wonder an alcoholic is strangely irrational. Who wouldn't be with such a fevered brain?" Now, this is cod science, but it's not sucked out at the end of his fingers, as they say in German. He hasn't made this up completely, so I've researched this at some length, and there is language used of this sort, the notion of pressure of the cerebrospinal fluid and certain rupturings taking place. And there were various beliefs about wet brain syndrome, and other conditions. Now, I'm not going to run through those in this session, but they're on the blog in the Zoom164 readings for anyone listening in 1,000 years' time. Zoom164 readings in this week. There's all of the data there and the link to the article where I got the information from. Okay, so on to chapter 11. We're really racing through it now. Now, the first bit is a little bit difficult. First bit of chapter 11 is the depiction of alcoholism in its various stages. So, you've got the first part of one's drinking career: conviviality, companionship, and colourful imagination, released from care, boredom, and worry. In other words, what the alcoholic is getting is the same as what everyone gets. It's not a special thing, it's an ordinary thing. And then it says there's a second phase where those old pleasures are gone. We can't recapture the great moments of the past. And during that phase, you still want to go back. There is an illusion that the downturn in business is a temporary aberration, a state of affairs brought about by some unfortunate external circumstances. There's a resistance against the idea that the alcoholism is progressive. There's the belief that you can go back to the earlier stage. And then there's a third stage, and this is in the second paragraph. We withdrew from society, from life itself. Some of us sought out sordid places, hoping to find understanding, companionship, and approval. This person is no longer experiencing conviviality, companionship, and colourful imagination. This person is past the stage of believing that they can go back to that first stage. That is gone. They're very definitely in a new stage, which is hellish. And the only mitigation of that wretched condition is having the company of other sufferers. And then there is a fourth stage when even that becomes elusive. It says momentarily we found this, but then we're facing the hideous four horsemen: terror, bewilderment, frustration, despair. So we've got four very clear stages here, and if you've been paying attention, you'll see these 4 stages map very neatly onto the 4 stages of alcoholism described in the chapter To Wives. It's quite remarkable how the 2 things align. Now, the thing to note is you can be in the 4th stage, terror, bewilderment, frustration, and despair, and know you're in it and still continue to drink for years, because I did. Now, the reason I'm saying all that is because I'd like to contrast that with the narrative that you get in meetings. And dear old Clancy, I think there's a lot in what he says, but essentially there's this theory that all alcoholics, all addicts, are under this permanent illusion that joy and peace and happiness really do lie at the bottom of the glass or at the end of the hit. And I think that's a stage. That's the 2nd stage. But the 3rd stage and the 4th stage are way beyond that. In other words, I'm not using on the basis of grounds, motivations to get back to that state. That's an illusion which is accompanying the reason why I'm using. Why am I using? I'm compelled. If I'm compelled, grounds don't come into it. And that's just something to think about. Not everyone gets this straight away. It's quite a difficult idea. The difference between the technical terms, you might as well have them. Cause and effect, ground and consequent. Cause and effect. Why did the vase fall off the fridge? Because the cat pushed it. That's cause and effect. Why did the cat push the vase? That's a question of ground and consequent. The cat had a purpose. The cat had a motivation. Those were the cat's grounds. They're different types of causal relation. And I would hold that the book Alcoholics Anonymous overwhelmingly supports the idea that we're using and drinking not because we have motivations, but because we're compelled. There is a cause within us which is compelling us, and as soon as we're compelled, motivation doesn't come into it. If you're in a queue and you don't like the look of the person in front of you, so you give them a shove, they're being noisy or something, you're doing that on the basis of a motivation. But imagine if the person behind you is getting something out of their bag and they push you and you push the person in front. If the person in front says to you, "Why'd you do that?" You say, "What do you mean, why did I do that? I wasn't doing it for any reason. The person pushed me and that caused me to push you." There are 2 different types of why. And what the book is very clear about, if you look at Bill was miserable on page 15, yet stayed sober. He was miserable in the Mayflower Hotel, yet stayed sober. The man of 30 was happy, yet relapsed. Roland Hazard was sorted out mentally and physically in the peak of mental and physical condition and relapsed. Jim, perfectly ordinary day, no problems of any significance, relapsed. Fred, perfect day, perfect life, relapsed. Those are signs not of people who are drinking on the basis of motivation, but people who are drinking because they are caused to drink by a mechanism activated within them, which then passes the baton to a second mechanism within them, which compels them to continue drinking. So Dr. Silkworth, in all the way back in the Doctor's Opinion, if you remember that, says, these men were not drinking to escape. They were drinking to overcome a craving beyond their beyond their mental control. In other words, the craving, and craving is compulsion. It's not motivation. It's not a mental cognitive process. It's the drinking in that situation is a response to an impulse which cannot be withstood. And the next section creates problems because it gives the impression that unhappiness is what leads to relapse. What it says about the boy whistling in the dark. By the way, the boy whistling in the dark, he says, let me just post this in the chat. The boy whistling in the dark says, I don't miss it at all, feel better, work better, having a better time. As ex-problem drinkers, we smile at such as Sally. Now, I have to point this out. So what Sally means here is a proffered explanation. It doesn't mean a silly person, but I remember someone rather brilliantly saying, yes, I was that Sally, as if to say, we smile at such a Sally, we're calling him a Sally. No, that's not a word in that sense, just to clear up that little linguistic problem. Now, what it says is, he fools himself. Inwardly, he would give anything to take half a dozen drinks and get away with them. He will presently try the old game. And this is the problem, for he isn't happy about his sobriety. He cannot picture life without alcohol. Some day he will be unable to imagine life either with alcohol or without it. Then he will know loneliness such as few do. Now, the unrecovered state will give rise to two things at once. The unrecovered state is a state in which I am battling the compulsion to drink on my own. And by virtue of that fact, I'm also necessarily not seeking God. I don't have a relationship with God. So all of my other problems are simply continuing and getting worse and worse because of my whole history, my broken psychology. Now, in that untreated condition, the reason the relapse happens is because the individual is untreated, the alcoholism is activated, and the chap has no defence against it. So the unhappiness and the reactivation of the alcoholism and the drinking again are simultaneous conditions. One is not causing the other. This does appear to create a contradiction with the rest of the book, but one just has to write it off as sloppy writing. The rest of it is so consistent. You have to forgive this passage. The thing is, otherwise, if you say, well, it is unhappiness that is causing it, why are so many unhappy people in AA staying sober? Staying sober quite well. And why is it that people sometimes slip when things are going really well? It wouldn't make any sense. So to simply see the unhappiness as the condition, as the necessary condition of someone who is unrecovered, but not the thing which itself is producing the relapse, then the whole thing, that tiny little change, brings this passage entirely in line with the rest of the book. Now, there's a little idea that does the rounds in AA and CA, and it's almost become part of the fabric, part of the furniture of the fellowship. And people say, and I've said it, and I disagree with my former self, I would say, if alcohol doesn't do anything special for you, it won't do anything special to you. That alcoholics and addicts are affected in a particularly special way by alcohol and drugs, which and that doesn't do it for normal people in the same way. I think it's highly speculative. You hear a whole range of experiences within the fellowship. People who reacted very, very strongly to alcohol and drugs, and other people who didn't. Where there isn't this sort of terrifically different response from the friends around them. A lot of people, they say that their response was exactly the same as it was of the people around them. It just took hold in a different way. And also concomitant with this is this idea that we're sort of special people with special spiritual needs, which is very flattering, but I don't think is compelling. What the chapter says, that alcohol gives people, and substitute drugs for this, is, where is it? Release from care, boredom, and worry. And it says that's what it gives normal people. It doesn't say normal people get, I don't know, something else, and we get released from care, boredom, and worry. That's what normal people get. And what do we get out of AA? We get, as it says, next page, release from care, boredom, and worry. We're rendered into a condition of ordinary happiness, ordinary bubbliness. I would say release from care, boredom, and worry is the ordinary condition of someone with psychological health. And I know plenty of people outside the fellowship who don't struggle with depression, anxiety, who don't have care, boredom, and worry. Little things happen here and there, but they're basically, they've got resilience, they've got character, they can deal with things, they take things in their stride. It says your imagination will be fired, life will mean something at last. For regular people who are psychologically healthy, their imaginations are fired. Life means something for them already. So what the program does, it doesn't elevate me to a special sort of higher state. It restores me to the ordinary condition of a healthy person. And the reason this is important to me is I'm not trying to achieve something weird and special. I'm trying to achieve something ordinary. And that brings it within the realm of the achievable. I've spent many years, and I don't think I suffered because of this, but on a spiritual wild goose chase, thinking I need to have a special spiritual experience and swallow whole 5,000 spiritual books in order to elevate me out of this realm into some other higher realm and to divorce me and separate me from humanity, which I thought was rather contemptible. I don't think this is great. Now, I learned a lot from doing that, but I think a sign of a good recovery is being ordinarily integrated into everyday life and loving it. You listen to the radio, you love it. You walk through a city, you love it. You meet people and you have lunch with them and you love it. I don't need anything special to have a perfectly ordinary, lovely day. And I think that's a nice ambition to have. It takes the pressure off considerably. One more, and then we'll do some questions, and I think we'll get through the rest of the chapter next week. The following passage, what we'll start with next week, is going to be on the anatomy of a relapse, how it happens and how you're saved from it. Anyway, the next passage is fascinating. How can they rise out of such misery, bad repute, and hopelessness? The practical answer is that since these things have happened among us, they can happen with you. And yes, do come through with your questions in writing, please. Now, what's brilliant here is it's saying to the person, but I don't understand. How is it even possible? And the answer is a refusal to answer the question. It doesn't tell you how it happens. It simply says, it worked for us, it'll work for you. Stop asking questions. Give it a go. Maybe then you'll see. And this is the way round. If you've got an argumentative or difficult sponsee, I know all of your sponsees are charming, but I've occasionally had a difficult one of my own. You have to stop answering why questions after a while, because if anyone, this is an age test, I think, for anyone at least who is British. If anyone remembers the Fairy Liquid adverts from about 40 years ago, there's this sequence of questions where the child asks a question and the parent who's doing the washing up with Fairy Liquid gives an answer, and the child says, why? Why? And no answer satisfies the child, and sponsees are like that. you realise after a while they're asking questions just to keep the conversation going. It's like the line is tapped and they're waiting until someone can get a trace on it or something. They're just trying to keep you talking until your location can be identified. At some point you just have to say, buddy, get on with it, and then you'll get it. Okay, on to preguntas. What do psychologists help with that a sponsor and the 12 steps don't, given both focus on thinking and the mind? And how does one know one needs one? Well, you've got three different categories you're potentially asking about. You've got psychologists, you've got psychotherapists, and you've got psychoanalysts. And I'm bringing all three in because those are three entirely different domains. People often bundle them together, and they shouldn't be bundled together. I came across the profile of someone, I'm not going to say who they are, someone I know, and on their profile it presented their CV as including the exposure to or experience with psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. I was, wait a second, I know they've both got psycho at the start of them, but that's like saying gardening and optometry. These are two entirely different things. You can't put them together. So what are they for? They're those three types of professional for very different things. What are they good for? You have to ask them. You get them to tell you what they offer. That's not my business. But what I will share is a couple of individual experiences. I know someone that was very, I think the term is dissociated. Their feelings were not congruent with their life. There was a lot of suppression of emotion. And what the psychotherapist helped them very effectively to do was to get in touch with what they were actually feeling, to peel back the layers of denial and self-delusion. And once that was done, they were really rather able to engage in recovery in an effective way, which they hadn't been able to do before. I've seen people who quite rightly have a tremendous trust, particularly in a long-standing relationship with a helping professional in one of those three areas. And the mere fact of going and talking for an hour a week or an hour a day acts as an extremely stabilizing influence for someone who would simply spin out of control. And the idea that that professional responsibility should somehow be transferred to an amateur in AA is alarming. And if you've ever tried to sponsor someone and carry the burden of someone with that degree of psychic damage, you'll know how impossible it is, and those sponsorship relationships burn out very quickly. There's one aspect as well which I think is terribly useful, which is cognitive distortions and cognitive biases. Sometimes a psychologist or a cognitive behavioral therapist who's got experience with cognitive psychology can be incredibly good at helping people see where their thinking is simply irrational and is not an adequate response to the events that are taking place. In other words, they help them to develop something called metacognition, which is the ability to stand outside their own thinking and see it for what it is. And that's enormously helpful. You see, they're doing very, very different things. I've not been in psychoanalysis, I've been in psychoanalytical psychotherapy with someone that was a psychoanalyst and then in their 50s retrained as a psychotherapist and worked as a psychotherapist after that, and he was in his 60s, I think, that chap. So I got a little bit of experience of that. My experience is that it did some good in the short term, in that it helped collapse my structures of delusion that I could fix any of my problems by trying harder. How he did it, no idea, but it was very successful. In the space of 6 months, I went from having a job and a career and a house and a marriage-like relationship to having none of those. 6 months, everything gone. Was that success? I think so. I lost everything. Splendid. I needed to. And then, took another year, then I was ready to start doing some recovery stuff on it. But it needed to be, I needed to be collapsed. And so it brought me to collapse far quicker than anything else could have. If I hadn't been brought to complete collapse by that experience, I don't think I'd have been ready for the recovery. I then had to toddle on for a year trying to resurrect something from the ashes myself to realise I couldn't before I was ready to accept what AA was offering. That's when I came back to AA. I didn't drink during this period, but I went a little peculiar, and when I came back I was as willing as I've ever been for anything, and that's when my recovery really took off. That was 25 years, 23, 24 years ago. So it can be extremely useful at certain points in the process, but they're doing very, very different things, and they shouldn't be seen as alternatives because they're not covering the same territory. Question. You explained slogans in the big book. Where did some other ones come from, most commonly seen at AA meetings? Think, 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 one day at a time, let go and let God, etc. The answer to that is no idea. But I think is a very interesting one, because often it is displayed upside down in meetings to indicate that that's the one thing that you absolutely shouldn't do, is think. And now, I don't want to offend any of our former colonial cousins across the Atlantic, but there's, in contrast to my French leanings, there's a tiny little bit of anti-intellectualism in America at times. There's a good dose of it in this country. George Mikesh, who was naturalised as George Mikes, was a Hungarian satirist who immigrated into the United Kingdom in the late 1940s. Was part of the Hungarian expat community, and he wrote the most wonderful books. He wrote a book on how to be an alien. Now, alien then meant a foreign national, not an extraterrestrial. He wrote a book called How to Be an Alien, which was how to be foreign in the United Kingdom and how to cope with the British, and it's hysterical. There's also another one, I think there's one on how to be German as well. But he talks about one of the sterling qualities of the British is how if you were bottom in Latin at school, you'd brag about it, and if you were top in Latin at school, you'd keep it under your hat. And this being a salient feature of the British to discount intellect and intelligence, and to see stupidity and blind obedience as great virtues. Now, I think stupidity and blind obedience go quite a long way in recovery, actually. But I think the ideal is to learn how to think. By turning think upside down, I can see some of the Europeans siding with the French on this. Think is upside down. Because what it's encouraging me to do is not to think obsessively about myself and my problems. What it might be encouraging me to do is to take a critical distance with regard to my own hyperbolic, highly emotional reactions to things, to sit down with a grown-up and analyse coldly the facts. And I think that is enormously beneficial. Have a look at the concept of metacognition, the gains that one can make in one's life by being able to stand outside one's own thoughts and look at them in an unattached way. In other words, being willing to jettison any train of thought, any belief, any idea which doesn't accord with the truth, not simply to take something for granted because our emotions support it, or to take something for granted because Sally said it, even if Sally is usually right. I would encourage you to challenge yourself at anything I say or anything anyone else says. It is simply suggested, it is simply offered, it's not told. Question. Someone saying about these phases, do you ever go back to phase 1? Is it as black and white for the other process addictions, e.g. money and spending, work and food? Maybe one does need to work overtime and it's not necessarily a compulsion. I think it's a brilliant question. You've got two separate matters there. With process addictions, you've got essentially two different types of process addiction. You've got a process addiction where the thing itself is unnatural. So gambling is not a natural thing. I know, let's leave aside game theory and chance and risk in evolutionary psychology. That's a different question. But gambling as an activity is not a physiologically normal thing to be doing. So if your process addiction is something like that, then can you go back to the first phase? No. With food and with sex, honestly, I'm afraid you're going to, if you ask 100 people, you'll get 50 views on one side, 50 views on the other. With some people, they return, as it were, to a normal relationship with food. The sort of Parisian way of eating is you can eat whatever you want, just don't eat between meals and keep the quantities small, and your figure will remain sylph-like forever. But you don't ban particular foods, you don't demonize particular food groups, you learn to exercise restraint. Marlene Dietrich, when she was on set, used to restrict her food and beverage intake and not simply succumb to desires whenever they arose. And she said, in order to teach the body who is in charge. And learning to control impulses is going to need to be done anyway when it comes to all sorts of other things. Answering back, speaking up, saying your piece, getting angry. One needs to learn to control impulses. Some people, and I believe them, say they can never safely go back to wheat-based products. If that's true for you, that's true for you. With me, my job over the years with food, I haven't had a very extreme eating disorder. I would say my eating has been disordered as opposed to having an eating disorder. I've tried regimes and restrictions, and everything breaks after a while. And what I've come to is learning how to not respond to every impulse to eat that comes into my brain. Learning to say no to myself. As I say, because one needs to learn that anyway with other things. Now, if that's not possible, or not possible yet, you're not doing anything wrong. I know a lot of people that need to go for a very long time with an incredibly strict approach. But you look at the S fellowships, you've got SA, which allows you very little, and then you've got SLA and SCA, where you set your own reasonable boundaries as to what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. So unfortunately, you're going to have to find your own way on that one. And this question here. Someone talking about compulsive desires suddenly appearing after a while of feeling stable. And is it a sign of an underlying addictive pattern rather than actual desire? The thing is, I talked to a German doctor in Frankfurt who was the chief physician of the largest mental hospital which also doubled as the treatment centre in the Frankfurt area. And we corresponded for a while on various matters, and he was very interesting, extremely supportive of AA and as a method, but also extremely supportive of our theories as to both of the two mechanisms in operation. The mechanism which gets activated when you're sober, which takes you back to the first drink or whatever, and secondly, the physical mechanism which is activated by the first drink. Now, he says the neuroscience is far more complicated than was suspected back in the 1930s, but the essential ideas are correct, which is once an addict, also an addict. You need to not activate it. If you activate it, good luck to you. Those weren't his exact words, but that was approximately what he said. But one of the things he said was that the circuitry of the addiction is embedded in the circuitry of desire and reward. It's not like a separate department. It's an overdrive that reward department goes into. I'm just trying to put it in sort of everyday language. I've certainly experienced over the years the quite extraordinary, really out of the blue reactivation of compulsive patterns, process addiction patterns. And honestly, my conclusion after being in fellowships for 33 years is, who fucking knows why these things resuscitate and reactivate? They can happen when things are going well, they can happen when things are going badly. With process addictions, you just have to shut it down as quickly as you can and hope for the best. But as to why they happen, I think it's unfathomable. It's rather like one's affect, how one feels generally, one's baseline mood is a function of literally hundreds of different factors. Short-term, long-term, physical, mental, social, all feeding into this one frame of mind right now. It's rather like mixing paints. Once they're mixed, you can't tell what the original paints were. And so trying to look for a specific cause behind behind an event in time in the brain, forget it. You're not going to do it. It's multifactorial. You can't pin it down. But what I would say, it happens to the best of us. And to the worst, but it happens to the best of us. A friend of mine who is no spiritual slouch says that with her, sometimes the food resuscitates as a problem and it causes her to go to God in a really big, concerted way. And she says it's not out of the question that this resuscitation of the addictive process is simply God's way of getting one's attention to bring one back, like the rumble strip at the side of the road. So you've got the rumble strip, and then you've got the ditch way down, or the ravine the way down. The ravine is alcohol, drugs. The rumble strips is the reactivation of the process addictions. Just a little bit too much time on Instagram today. That's the rumble strip. And so sometimes I need to, as a friend of mine puts it, unwind my position and keep it real for a few days. So to get really disciplined around the trouble areas of sexual thought and action, romantic thought and action, interaction with social media and food. I think those are the ones where sometimes you have to artificially impose greater restrictions than are strictly necessary just to bring yourself back on track, to allow yourself to go to God instead of those things for relief. But you can't stop being human, and I don't think that's what we're here for. Someone saying, this is the next, and then we're at the end. When working step 4 with previous sponsors, I was asked to bring up resentments going back to childhood. I found that overwhelming and my mind went blank. Recently, a group message suggested focusing only on present resentments or those that keep resurfacing. Can someone still get sober and well working step 4 this way, and wouldn't that overlap with step 10? Okay, the purpose of step 4 is to get a handle on how my mind operates, on what my ego motivations are, to get a handle on my behaviour. If you want to find out what someone's value system is, you find all of the things that upset them. If you want to get to the truth, they need to calm the F down. They need to get over the emotional ups and downs of having constant grievances. Now, the purpose of the resentment inventory is to give me sufficient evidence that I can say, right, I get the anatomy of resentment now. I understand the futility, the folly of it, the danger of it, the nonsense of it. There's, if you want a book on forgiveness, by the way, there's a French philosopher called Vladimir Jankélévitch, of Ukrainian origin, Jankélévitch with a J. I think it's been translated, it's called Pardon in French, or Pardon in English. Brilliant. But he talks about essentially the idiocy of resentment, because it's locking an event in the past and holding it in the present, yet the person who did the thing has been transformed 100,000 times over since they did that thing 30 years ago. So you're resentful against someone who literally no longer exists. You're mad. You need to stop it. And he says a lot of other things. But the point is, the resentment inventory is merely to give me a suitable set of examples, worked examples, that I'm motivated to say, right, I'm going to systematically adopt a different attitude: pity, patience, tolerance, kindness, and love towards anyone who I think has hurt me, threatened me, impaired my interests, damaged me, wronged me, offended me, ever. And you apply that blanket universal amnesty to everyone. Now, the question is, how do you come up with the material? This way: what's eating your lunch? What's bothering you? It's the things that bother you the most that matter. If the things that bother you the most are the things happening now, write about that. If it's the things that bothered you 40 years ago, fair enough, ski, write about that. Doesn't matter. What I would say with the recent stuff, if you want to analyse it, if it happened recently, what you're writing about hopefully is things that you can remember with a reasonable degree of accuracy. The trouble is with writing about stuff from childhood, it's a mirage by the time it's 30 years later. It's a fairy tale. None of it's real. So you can't do anything very useful with it. Now, where the childhood does come in, and it's necessary, if stuff bothered you in your childhood, things that happened to you, things you did, those both need to come out in step 5. But you don't need to go looking for things. If you had a perfectly ordinary childhood and nothing particular happened, and you're, scratching around for things which no longer bother you, just stop it. Now, the fact is, 9 out of 10 people that come to their step 4, most of the things that bother them are from their childhood and major relationships. Very few are present. So this injunction to go back through your life and look at everything from childhood is absolutely right. So I don't think the sponsors were wrong, per se. But what doing this over a long time does is it gives you flexibility to deal with people who come at recovery with different types of problem. I'll finish on this point. I know a couple of you are yawning, quite rightly. I've lost sponsees in the past because I wasn't able to be flexible enough in the approach to adapt it to how the person was. So I've had, even in the past few years, I think I'm getting it more right now than I've ever got it before, but even 3 or 4 years ago, there were people I lost whose resentments were so fucking mad. Fair enough. I think mine probably were when I was new as well. But I was trying to adopt an analytical approach which didn't work on resentments, which were just mad. You've got to do it differently, and I do it differently. When I've got people now whose resentments are just nuts, we have a good old laugh at it. We don't analyse them because there's nothing there. It's just ridiculous. And then we get through it, and it's great, and we're out the other side. I've lost a lot of sponsees by being too rigid, saying it has to be this way, in terms of the intellectual approach to the program. So those sponsors, they weren't getting it wrong. They were doing what they could. And maybe over time they will be more flexible and learn how to do it different ways. But it takes decades to learn how to be flexible with this. So you've got to forgive people. No one's getting it wrong. No one's getting it wrong. They're simply sponsoring the way they feel guided to. No one is doing it maliciously. No one is doing it intentionally badly. If something doesn't suit you, that's just because there's not a match. It's not because anyone's doing anything wrong. So that's the end of me, Keith.